Thank you so much. Minor detail. We can invite perhaps the Mr. Aldari and Kirali on that.
We're going to get started with the first part of the opening remarks. Please have a seat and we have
Put the microphones here, so open here.
Speak from here.
yeah.
Whatever you prefer, whatever you
What would
feel.
you like? I can call you if you prefer.
If you want, no, it doesn't matter for me. I'm Abdullah, UNDP. How are you?
Speaking from the lectern.
So
Yeah.
maybe we see if you start by sitting and then I'll call you.
Well, less crazy by the day.
Anywhere?
So
Maybe that'll rock you too much here. Have
more
a
than
seat here.
better.
Okay, that's good.
This is the state secretary.
Thank you very much. Oh, we can do that.
As you wish. And then, I think he said he's fine to sit there, whatever. And then maybe when the minister
Let's move
the microphones, yeah. I'll hold them. Yeah, okay.
Is this on? Can you hear me?
There's headphones. We probably don't need them, but I'll bring them just in case.
Good morning, everyone. You can hear me well? Excellent. We're a very warm welcome for what hopefully is the first event of the day, and you haven't been up earlier than this. No, it's not. My name is Srilata Kamila. I'm the Global Head for Climate Change Adaptation at UNDP. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event about closing the gap, financing gap to address urgent adaptation challenges. And we have a very distinguished set of speakers and panelists today, so it's really our honor to welcome them. Just before we get started, just to frame the conversation today, this event will primarily focus on looking at complementarities between the planning and priorities that countries have been communicating, and linking that to investment planning, financial strategies, and really financial mechanisms and the enabling environments that allow us to move into implementation and urgent action on the ground. And it's my pleasure to acknowledge EIB, the lead for this event, as well as the co-organizers with the European Commission's Director General for DG NEAR, and of course UNDP as well is a co-organizer. The EU, EIB, and UNDP have had a long-standing collaboration and partnership in working with countries and helping them address adaptation globally, but also in particular, Western Balkans and the southern and eastern neighborhoods. So we're very pleased to have this conversation that will allow us to reflect on the growing vulnerabilities and the climate emergency and hear from countries on the challenges and the needs, but also showcase partnerships and examples and successes that have been working in scaling up adaptation efforts, and discuss the mechanisms that really allow us, both with the enabling environments, the policy environments, the tools for adaptation planning, investment planning, as well as innovative financial solutions that really get us to the heart of addressing these challenges. So with that, let me actually start the first part of the session, which will be opening remarks by our three distinguished speakers from the three organizers. And then we will move to a high-level panel with the senior representatives from Egypt, Moldova, and we have AFD and UNEP as well who will join us on the panel. With that, let me first start by welcoming Mr. Ambroise Fayole, the Vice President of European Investment Bank, to give us some opening remarks. And would you prefer to stay there to give the remarks?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Uh, does it work? Yes. So you should take
Might not be
you should take a headphone if you want to. If you don't want to listen, it's fine. um, good morning to all of you, and thanks a lot to come at this early hour for a very, very important session. And many thanks to those who have organized it. There are 3 points I would like to make, and I'll do that briefly. One, where we are as EIB. I mean, climate adaptation has always been a key element in our climate bank roadmap. We have taken a target that has been taken in 2021, which is to triple our commitment by 2025. We had at the time 2021, we are more, to make it simple, a mitigation bank. So for us, adaptation is something that we need to work on. We just had in 2021 5% of our climate action that was in adaptation, and the target was to move to 15%. We will be at the end of this year probably above 10%, but below 15%. And we hope that we will reach the target next year. This is a challenge for us, but I think it's a challenge that we will meet. And actually, what we do for reaching this target is making sure that we put questions on adaptation in all the projects we finance. Because what we see is in Europe, questions related to flooding, fires, I mean, force you to ask the question, do we have the right mix between mitigation and adaptation? And outside Europe, this is even more true. The second thing I would like to say is we are not alone in our journey. We are partnering with critical institutions. And there are two that are extremely important for us. The first one is UNDP, and the second one is DG NEAR. And we are very pleased to have as so close partners for us the European Commission. And actually, we can show a few concrete examples, and I'm very pleased that high-level representative from Egypt and Moldova will come, because we have two good examples of adaptation projects that we have done there. One in Egypt is especially related to support agricultural production and food security against the risks of sea level rise and other climate impacts in the northern delta of Egypt. And we are also exploring investments in the water sector, expected to contribute to climate adaptation by improving networks and water supply infrastructure and reducing non-revenue water. And the second one is in Moldova. It's the forest development program, where we have the restoration and rehabilitation of degraded lands and forests. This is very, very interesting. Actually, we do that also in co-financing with the French Development Agency, AFD. We have signed this week with Côte d'Ivoire a similar project on reforestation of the country by 20%. And these are really, really great projects. Beyond these two, Egypt and Moldova, we try to do more on adaptation in other countries, and there is one that I would like to mention in particular. It is in Jordan, where we have supported the country in adapting to increasingly scarce water resources due to climate change, with 1.3 billion euros in financing provided for water sector in the last 10 years, including the Aqaba Amman water desalination and conveyance project. That is a great project, I have to say, which is also for us very new in its structure, because it is a result-based loan, something that I had seen in my previous life at the World Bank for some time, but that is really new for EIB, and I'm very pleased that we have embarked also in this kind of projects. We do also some funds. The CRAFT, for example, is an interesting one, Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance Technology Transfer Facility. That is the first private sector fund dedicated to resilience to climate change in developing countries, with a few interesting projects that they have financed. Now, I will finish by a few words on where we are heading. And here I have mixed views. There is a very positive report that was delivered here in Baku by the multilateral development banks on what the very sweet and nice acronym NCQJ, with MDBs ready to provide by 2030, in 2030 actually, 120 billion dollars of financing for low-income and middle-income countries, including 42 billion for adaptation. And that is the good news. That is the good news because this is a figure that is in very big increase compared with what we have today. And all MDBs are dedicated to this figure. That being said, where I am worried is we know that adaptation needs more concessional resources, subsidy resources than the rest of climate finance. And when you look at the environment of public figures for ODA, you can be worried that the momentum will not continue as much as expected. So I think we need to find ways to make sure that when there is resources that are public resources, we try to concentrate them on public adaptation. And the second thing is, when we can develop other ways of doing adaptation, we need to look at them. And I'm thinking in particular at something where the private sector is not very good at, because adaptation is often more difficult, more complex, less profitable, but we need to find ways to do more financing with private sector for the benefit of adaptation. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much, and I hope you'll enjoy the session.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambroise. Especially for that call to the private sector engagement. While yes, adaptation needs concessional finance, the whole idea of public finance is not enough, I think, is a critical message. So thank you for that. Let me now invite Mr. Abdallah Al-Dardari, who is the Assistant Secretary General and Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for the Arab States, ARBAS, for UNDP. So it's my pleasure, Mr. Abdallah, over to you for opening remarks.
Good morning, and apologies for the long title. Abdallah was enough. So what can you say after the Vice President of the European Investment Bank? Adaptation is a challenge, as you exactly said, because in mitigation, mainly energy transition, the financing structure is becoming clearer, return on investment is becoming clearer, and financial engineering in general for mitigation projects, especially energy transition, is becoming more mature, and we can see an expansion in that sector. Adaptation is more difficult because it really touches questions of public goods where the pricing is difficult and return on investment therefore becomes more complex to measure. I'll give you an example. In Iraq this year, with a little bit of technical assistance from UNDP and $500 million investment from the government, Iraq managed for the first time to produce 6.2 million tons of wheat, more than it is demand. And therefore, with a little bit of engineering, but with the fiscal space available, they managed to actually boost wheat production, which is At the same time, the country is suffering from drought and from shortage in supply of water from neighboring countries through transboundary water resources. So it's an example of if we put together the right packaging of technical assistance, funding and financing, especially concessional loans, credit guarantee, and so on, we will be able to expand and have much high impact on in the area of adaptation. As we speak, we have two drought challenges. One in the eastern side of the Mediterranean, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. We are facing this is the 7th year of drought in Syria, for example. So should one day Syrian refugees return, they have no farms to return to. And for political reasons, we cannot invest there today. So we are leaving the situation for, whenever it's permitted to operate. In North Africa, we are building a complete strategy for the water, food security, and energy nexus, simply because North Africa is facing the worst water crisis today, to the point where Tunisia banned irrigated farming, and now tens of thousands of farmers are moving from rural areas to urban areas for livelihood, adding to pressure, social pressure, and so on. How can we work together in combining technical assistance with funding and financing, and what type of financing engineering we can propose with technical assistance, because it's very important. Knowledge is extremely important, especially interdisciplinary knowledge, because it is not just a technical issue, it's water governance, agricultural governance, and all of that. So this is very important, what we are discussing today, and EIB and UNDP are very strong partners, but we feel that we can do much more together in the coming weeks, months, and years. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdallah. And as
She told me those tips before I started. Thanks to you.
you added plenty of ground examples, which brought it much closer to the truth, the ground truth. Thank you. And especially, I think, especially focusing on the fact that what are the levers of change, which we'll get into a lot more in the panel, and about the technical assistance, the policy environment, financial engineering, and how these pieces need to come together, which also speaks to the fact that nobody can do this alone, and hence the complementarity and partnerships that are critical. So thank you for that. And let me now introduce and also welcome Ms. Adrienne Kirali, who's the Director and Deputy General for DG NEAR, for your opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So really a pleasure to be here today with our close partners, the EIB and UNDP, to discuss this very important topic, as it was already highlighted by the distinguished speakers before me. Climate adaptation is a priority for the EU, as you know, and we have an adaptation strategy in place since 2021. But of course, even just recent events, like the ones that happened in Spain last month, show us that strategies are not enough and that we really have to step up our efforts. And if we see what has happened, it was a direct consequence of the exceptionally warm summer in 2023, the high sea temperatures, and now we see the devastating effects, which will make that we have huge efforts and also financial resources that will be needed to rebuild. If you just see the region of Valencia, and then we see what's happening also in the south, it's really something that reminds us every day that we have to step up our efforts. So, of course, we are doing a lot also, not in the EU, but also in the neighborhood, also together in close cooperation with our partners, because, this is indeed, it's happening everywhere. And also the neighborhood is hugely impacted by rising temperatures, shifting rainfalls, and increased pressure on water resources. And this is also something very specific in the eastern neighborhood, which I take care of. The water is a huge priority. Allow me to give you a few examples of flagship projects that we in the EU are working on in the EU neighborhood policy. I'll start with the Eastern neighborhood, where we finance and work together with UNDP to implement the EU Floor Climate Resilience Program. This is to enhance climate adaptation by supporting municipalities to develop projects in urban areas and where we actually give preference to nature-based solutions. In the Mediterranean region, we finance the ACAMED program, which is implemented by AFD, where we actually empower local communities to integrate climate adaptation into their policy and into their planning, also with the objective of driving sustainable change at all levels of the governance. And finally, also to give an example of a project that we are doing in Turkey and in the Western Balkans is the support that we are providing to 850 cities together with the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, where we support also the implementation of adaptation projects and capacity building to increase the resilience of local authorities. I would actually like to conclude on referring to the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report of 2024, which actually still points out the big gap that exists between what is needed for adaptation and the financing that is currently being delivered. We have to work on bridging this gap and to come with innovative financing solutions to make sure that we step up all our efforts. So with this, I'm looking forward to listening to the panel discussion, and thank you again for inviting me to this panel.
Thank you so much, Ms. Adrian. And in fact, I think what you ended on cues us very well for what the panel will discuss in terms of the bridging the financing gap. But thank you so much for sharing those examples, and especially the spotlight on the issues of the urban and what it means and the overall implications of what happens when cities are facing these kinds of challenges. So again, if you can all join me for an applause for our opening remarks and speakers. So thank you all so much for joining us and taking the time out of, I know, a busy schedule. With that, if I may actually request other panelists to come, and then if I could also ask you to exit the... Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You just drop it on the floor. That's fine. Thank you so much. Keep one here, if that's okay too. So I think we start without Egypt, or maybe, right? So we get started. That's okay. I'll leave a space in case. Thank you so much for joining us on this panel. Let me first start by introducing our distinguished panelists. We'll start with Anne Holoff from the UNEP, and you have been very deeply involved with the UNEP Finance Gap Report as well, so we really look forward to hearing from you on that. Ms. Carolina Nowak, you are the Secretary of State for Energy in Moldova, and thank you for joining us and especially being able to hear the country perspectives and challenges, and also what are some solutions you're approaching with. And Ms. Mathilde Baud-Laurence in the middle, Head of Climate and Nature at AFD. So thank you so much for joining, and just actually from where the opening remarks ended, and to refer back to the Finance Gap Report, the 2024 report, Come Hell and High Water. Again, it really does acknowledge that while there has been some increase from 22 billion in 2021 to about 28 billion in 2022 in terms of financing, it's still barely a 5% dent, if you will, for the gap. The gap, which is about 180 to 350 billion. So I think it's very, very clear from the remarks and the discussions, not just in this panel and around, of what we need to do. And as was also highlighted earlier, I mean, we've seen the warmest Northern Hemisphere summer, the hottest day ever recorded. and challenges from countries, and really widespread and devastating, especially for the most vulnerable populations. And with Moldova, I think the increasing temperatures, erratic rainfalls have really led to a lot of issues around food insecurity, leading to loss of life, loss of livelihoods. So I think very devastating impacts. I want to start actually also with the country perspective. We don't yet have Ms. Rania Al-Mashat from Egypt, but it'd be great, Ms. Carolina, if we can start with you, if that's all right. We'll start with the first question for you in terms of, how is Moldova translating the adaptation priorities into investment planning to begin with, and then maybe we can then get into the question of how do you then go from the planning to financial mechanisms that actually help implement adaptation. But the first question would be around how are you looking at those priorities, including from national adaptation plans and planning? So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Good morning, dear panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm working at the Ministry of Energy, but when it comes to the cataclysms that we have in the country, and we see already year by year we have the highest temperature, we have severe floods, we have severe droughts, heavy rains, as you well mentioned, and Moldova is known for its agricultural potential. 98% of its soil is highly fertile. Although already we see that IT and ICT is picking up in terms of reaching the same GDP share as agriculture, but however, a huge chunk of the population is relying upon the outputs of the agriculture activity that they're having. So it's a matter of subsistence as well, and well-being. So the situation as well across Europe, in fact, we have more and more farmers' protests. They are asking for more and more compensations. So the question is, what do we do in the long run? Yeah, how can we absorb these shocks? Because you cannot just provide compensations over and over and over if you don't manage at least to tackle a bit and to, at the issue in itself, or to alleviate the way they are being affected, or at least to provide some sort of a tool via which they can do the agriculture activity better. So, in fact, we have just recently contributed to the CCDR, so it's the Country Climate Development Report of the World Bank. And there are some stark images and graphs. They are saying that, for instance, by 2040, the corn's production will reduce by 40% if we continue having the same meteorological outcomes, and in general, climate change basically in Moldova. And the same goes then for sunflower seeds and some other agriculture crops. So once again, what do we do about that? And I'm very happy that indeed, and Vice President of the EIB mentioned that there is the 200 million euros loan provided on the afforestation. We have an ambitious ambitious goal there, and it's about so only 11% of the country's territory is has a forest. Basically, it's covered with forest. Now the president has set this as her own goal. She's very keen and ambitious about greening the country, so she set the percentage from 11 to 14 by 2033. It's quite ambitious, trust me. So basically, on a yearly basis, we have to make sure that we have the plantation in place. From an energy perspective, and again, here I'm also happy because I think IFIs play a huge role as well. in terms of providing the best financial mechanisms for adaptation policies. And this is the case with the projects that I'm happy to deal with and to run them. This is the energy efficiency project for instance, for the first 10 big hospitals in Moldova, and the EIB is also providing 30 million euros loans here. As well, then it comes an EBRD as well. So it's a beautiful conjunction, let's say, of EBRD, EIB, and the EU coming with the grant. That's a key marking, or I would say a flagship type of project, which we will then develop, and we are extending it and having almost 5 projects only for public institutions on energy efficiency. But just to finish my point on the adaptation, so what this CCD country climate development report showed is that we need roughly 146 million euros yearly just to cope with all of the floods and all of these natural disasters in the country. Clearly, we cannot do this by ourselves. Clearly, we cannot just do business as usual as we used to do. So a fundamental question then comes forward. And this is something on the side of the Agriculture Ministry to develop, and with the Ministry of Environment. First, where do you have actually these irrigation installations? Which cultures do you make sure that they need these irrigation systems? Maybe you have to install as well PVs to make sure you don't run them on, I don't know, gas-fired powered electricity produced. Second question, what type of cultures will you deploy? Maybe we don't actually need to grow corn and sunflower seeds if you know that it will be severely affected. Let's say we need to sit down and be true to ourselves, and also probably rethink and restructure a bit the development, the economic development of the country. And given that you have small resources, then you need to be smart into utilizing them and deploying them. And yes, as the predecessors mentioned, we need to be smart as well into deploying this with blended finance. It has to be managed smartly between concessional loans and grants where needed. This is what actually we are doing right now with the Residential Energy Efficiency Fund, which, trust me, it's also in a way some adaptation type of project, because 40% of the energy is being consumed. That's some noise there, interesting, sorry. 40% of the energy mix is then being consumed by the buildings. So that means instead of us just purely importing gas, we should actually then prioritize energy efficiency projects, which we have done, instead of just paying and providing, compensations for the end consumers' bills, in terms of, because today is also the energy day, so it's worth mentioning that. So, reason for which we prioritize the energy efficiency in the government is the second top priority. We launched this residential fund, which on one hand provides 70% grants and 30% is loan, and even there where there is a loan, we had made different categories for the energy vulnerability criteria for the population. There's different capacity to pay back that loan. So this is one example, and in conjunction with retrofitting being done to the building, there will be also measures such as PVs to be installed, especially for houses, not the case for block of flats. Houses, but also heat pumps in the future. So here the government can play a huge role, especially on technologies which are still expensive for the usual consumers, to put its money and to help driving this transition. Another simple example, it's also, I think, linked with adaptation, because ultimately it's about, and also mitigation in a way, public acquisitions. I recently realized we don't have a methodology on sustainable public acquisitions within the country. So how can we have in 2024 buses being bought and they are running on fossil fuels? Why aren't we being bold enough to make sure that these buses are EVs, and we then make sure also that we have the infrastructure in place? So my point here is that yes, there is a point in terms of the targets that we have the mandatory, by the way, towards the EU energy community as a candidate country. Yes, there is the internal laws that we have, climate action law that we have, by the way, recently approved and adopted, now are securing its implementation. Multiple strategies I'm not going to enter because we all know them. IFIs, of course, they play a substantial role, making it blending finance, putting full front the decarbonization goal, not financing any fossil fuel like the EIB is doing, which is fantastic. These things need to be put forward straightly. And then ultimately also, how do we make sure that we trigger the private investment? There's things, so for instance, on renewables auction, you know, if you have a solid framework, regulatory framework, the private sector will follow. I hope I didn't talk too much, and thank you.
No, thank you so much. And I think we always forget, like when we talk about adaptation, you could look at cross-cutting adaptation mitigation benefits. Energy for agriculture, energy for water, I mean, they're critical. And energy, while you may not look at it straight as an adaptation strategy, it reduces the vulnerability and the underlying structural issues that create more exposure and more vulnerability in communities. So that's one point, I think, which is not a common thing for us to discuss when we talk about adaptation, and we forget that these structural investments countries are making build resilience in many ways as well. And also thank you for pointing out the blended finance. I think hopefully that's also a conversation we continue, because it is important for us to have these kinds of examples and financial engineering and structuring, including blended finance, to understand that perhaps while there's concessionality, there is also market opportunity, and underlying technical assistance, capacity needs often need maybe a grant. And you pointed out the grant and EIB and government coming together. So thank you so much, and we'll come back to you perhaps later on as well as we proceed in the conversation. Ms. Mathilde, if I could ask you, in AFD, I mean, what kinds of strategies is AFD promoting for adaptation? And also, where do you see opportunities for further support, specifically in terms of moving towards solutions for countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for this panel. It's my first panel on adaptation, and it's been 4 days. So this is an issue, and I'm very pleased. Today I have 3 on adaptation, so it's going to change the balance. And I would like just to congratulate you, because you managed to stay focused with all this noise. I need to keep the headset to do the same. I don't like to be AFD centric, but it's your question, so I will try to explain and to drive you through AFD journey on adaptation finance, because I believe it can be of interest to see how to increase and mainstream adaptation and resilience within a development finance institution. Just to give you a few figures, in 2016 our annual funding on adaptation finance was around 500 million, and we reached last year 3 billion of adaptation finance, representing 40% of our climate finance. So we were very proud of this progress. We surpassed the target that the French government was asking us to do, which was 1/3 of our climate finance, with this 40%. This didn't happen in a day, of course, and so I will try to explain a little bit how we progressed. First, we did mainly 2 things. First, we created a flagship program, which is now also going to be deployed on the Mediterranean region with the support of the Commission, Adaptation, which is called ACAMED on this region. Adaptation, which is a program which is working on 3 pillars. One is knowledge, because we do believe that on adaptation we still need to build the scientific knowledge, the economic proof, bring in the local capacities and local knowledge, build new ways of working, including such as locally led adaptation principles, for instance, new ways for DFIs at least, not for everybody. But so this is a very important pillar. The second pillar is about capacity building, notably of the government entities with on NDC, NAP, everything related to planning and to financing those plans. And the third one is, of course, preparing investments on with a high adaptation target. And so we learned, we created methodologies, we created tools that in parallel, and this is the second part of our work, we mainstreamed. So we mainstream, meaning that we embedded this into our process through a number of tools. One is, of course, and I believe all of us now within the DFI world are at this stage, we all do a climate screening of our projects. So namely, having a look at the climate risk of the assets. This is first thing. But also mainstreaming how you take into account better vulnerabilities. This is a word that you just used. So what are the most vulnerable populations that you need to focus on, for instance. And the third part, I would say the third level, which is of course still work in progress, I don't say we do everything perfectly, is a lot about moving away from the project approach, taking into account the territory needs. I think it was very clear in your statement all around what you explained on the agriculture sector, for instance, in Moldavia. It's not a question of one irrigation project. It's a question of how what is the national policy on agriculture. And then how you deploy it with investment, whether public or private. So it worked because we really had a more systemic approach. It worked also, of course, because the risk is higher, the demand is growing. We have a lot of demand on food security, on water management, a lot of demand on nature, and a lot of demand on disaster risk management per se. So just quickly on few things that we need to progress on. What we are really looking into two major things. One is to indeed bring in better the private sector. There are options. Of course, the better the policy framework is, the vision from the territory, the easier it is to bring in the private sector. We have, for example, the examples of credit lines in the agriculture in Morocco. If you want to support a bank in assessing how an agriculture investment or corporate is doing with regard to adaptation, of course you need to take into account the country context and local context, and then you help them building criteria on how they should assess this project, and these are the type of work that we are doing, and it's progressing. I believe also a lot around the water, the nature part is also can be supported with the private sector funding. Proparco last year provided 200, so our private sector subsidiary, provided 200 billion of adaptation finance, a lot with water management infrastructure. The second part on which we need to progress is a lot about this continuum between adaptation finance, disaster risk management, and loss and damage. The line is blurry, even in the negotiations. All this is very important for a practitioner. It's difficult to say if €1 is more adaptation than disaster risk management and loss and damage, certainly. But still, we know that we need to progress on the deployment of preparatory tool, how we address, how the countries see the risk, know the risk, and wants to share the risk in between what needs to be kept at sovereign level and where we can bring in the private sector. And on this, there is also a lot of innovation, notably with insurance. When properly managed, properly blended, it can really be part of the solution. So I'll stop there. Innovation with adaptation and ACAMED, and mainstreaming with these tools.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I like how I think there's a continuity in the conversation because, firstly, congratulations. Very heartening to hear 40%. It's not often you hear those kinds of percentages in terms of climate finance that the banks are looking into. But it's interesting, I think, another aspect that you reiterated, which is for adaptation, the systemic lens is really important, whether it's at a sectoral level or it's about a landscape level or a territory, as you said. And then also at that level, perhaps having a better sense and understanding of the risks for investments. And so this conversation around what does it take to de-risk is important. But then that requires you to first understand the risks. So coming back to the knowledge and capacity building, fully agree. I think even in UNDP, we're primarily giving out grants. But really using those grants to crowd in requires us to say, how do you put those grants to use in a way that strategically looks at de-risking, whether it's addressing information asymmetries or risk asymmetries. And then thanks also for talking about then the risk transfer or risk reduction mechanisms. Hopefully we pick up some of those examples and dive into them later on as well. Thank you so much. And then over to you in terms of, yes, the financing gap report is there, but can you talk about few of the highlights of that? Where are the most gaps being seen? But then also, what are the levers of change countries have in terms of supporting adaptation solutions? Thank you, Anne.
Thanks very much. And let me start by saying, I think maybe the biggest challenge is that we are now at about 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But as we also know from the emissions gap report, based on current policies, the current level of efforts brings us towards 3.1 degrees Celsius. So this is just the beginning, and we really need to become much more anticipatory and look ahead. And I think that's already been mentioned around the room. We also used to talk, and I've been inspired by the previous speakers here, and you, of course, because when I first started this, we talked a lot about mainstreaming adaptation into development, mainstreaming climate into development, and we still do, but we still haven't managed to really succeed in doing that. But we can't really separate these issues. Mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, all are intrinsically intertwined with development. And in fact, when I used to be working very closely on the adaptation gap report. Now I'm only on the steering committee. But when we looked at the most important indicators for adaptation and adaptive capacity, they were basically all development indicators. So we can't separate between these issues. But if we're talking about the biggest gaps, we can also directly relate to some of the biggest levers actually for change. And of course, you already mentioned the biggest gap when it comes to adaptation is probably the gap between the adaptation finance needs and the flows currently available. And last year in the adaptation gap report, these costs and needs were updated, where we assessed that the adaptation costs and needs were in the range of $215 billion to $387 billion, whereas the flows are in the order of, well, they're below $30 billion in 2022. And although they have increased, they're still more than 10 times lower than the actual needs. So of course there's a huge gap here. Of course this is only for international public adaptation finance flows. We don't have any good measures or indicators on domestic public finance, nor do we have very good measures and estimates of private, both domestic and international finance flows. So those are really important to get a better handle on and also bring more into place. What we also see, and I go back to that, is that generally it's much easier to finance so-called no regret and reactive and incremental and project by project adaptation activities than the more anticipatory and even some call them transformational, but at least more fundamental and cross-sectoral ones. So that's something which is at the same time a lever, I think, because it offers an opportunity both for countries but also for supporting agencies in focusing more on shifting more towards focus on these more forward-looking types of adaptation actions. And that is also the case, of course, for private sector financing. We also see still, and you've also been talking about that in Moldova, that institutional, regulatory, financial, and capacity-related barriers continue to be key issues, and also basically hampering both adaptation actions, but also their results. This is, of course, also where there are huge opportunities for improvement and for building stronger partnerships with countries as we continue to try and support adaptation goals and needs are being met. Maybe I should just stop there for now.
Thank you, Anne. I think, again, yeah, those are still very stark numbers. But like you said, I think in some ways the gaps around finance and capacity are also obviously the levers then for change. And how do you look at technical assistance or capacity building from that perspective, and then policy and regulatory environment. But it's very interesting. You also brought up this notion of incremental versus transformational. And I was on a panel yesterday and we said, well, it is a spectrum. And what is incremental in one context can be transformational in another context. And going back to Mathilde, the phrase you use, locally led adaptation. So adaptation is local, and what's transformational needs to be definitionally and practitionally kind of in practice understood by the governments and the communities. And perhaps there the blend across different kinds of adaptation and loss and damage and humanitarian, incremental, transformational. Sometimes it's concerning that we sit up here and get bogged down by these terms, but at the community level, something that may seem very mundane might be quite transformative for their lives. So I think it's good to understand these gaps in that perspective and contextualize them locally. So thank you for bringing those up. If I could come back to you, Ms. Carolina, in terms of, and I'm also a bit cognizant of time, but both you pointed to a lot of funds and solutions, because my next question was going to be, what have been those some financial solutions you're designing? But perhaps a little bit more focus on that, and then also, how do you see partners like us supporting a government? How can EU and EIB and AFD, UNDP, UNEP partners, where do you see their role, especially when they come together, we come together in a partnerships? What's their complementary role that can best serve your needs?
Okay, so there are quite a few things. Look, for instance, when we have created the Ministry of Energy last year, we have created a new institution, or let's say we reset it up. It's called the National Center of Sustainable Energy, with whom we are deploying the biggest right now energy efficiency, and including, I would say, even energy communities. They will be involved. By the way, that's also another fantastic topic. And I think the absence of trust, I felt it, a certain absence of, okay, it's new, but how do we know that's a reliable institution? How do we know that it has a solid governance and it's capable to deploy these programs, and that this finance eventually can be channeled? That was one element, and okay, of course we then work, and we are very happy to work also with the UNDP, with whom we initially managed to deploy some pilots in order to, for instance, even for this residential energy efficiency fund, to deploy it nationally. The same went for the eco voucher, first pilot, and then national program, which I understand it comes both ways, and perhaps it's also, you need some time to show the outcomes, the immediate outcomes of that institution, and that's understandable in many regards. But I would say also the absence of, let's say, of this financial mechanism, and this was the case as well for so this program I mentioned, that is deployed energy efficiency program for hospitals. It was something new, and it moved very slow in many regards. So we needed to have involved many stakeholders to make sure that it takes the right speed. And for the residential sector, certainly we need. That's what we have also recently realized, that we need some guarantees, like state guarantees, and we needed to create something new. But I would also add to this something else, that speed is very important for a government which is aiming to get to the EU by 2030, which has binding targets. So I understand, governments, they think in cyclical ways, in 4 years term. And people as well judge them accordingly upon the 4-year term. What have you managed to achieve? And if it only takes us 2 or 3 years to manage a setup, an institutional setup for that institution, to deliver that programs, then you can imagine that by the end of that mandate, you don't manage to. How do we show to people that energy efficiency program, it's worth investing in, it's worth putting your money and paying that 30% loan? It's more. It requires something more than just awareness on communication, but they want concrete examples. And speed, it's something that I would say that for a smaller government, it's at times easier and it's more flexible a smaller country, to adopt certain decisions and to have the right speed than, I would even say, than other IFIs. Another element which I think we figured it out on our own on ourselves, it was learning by doing. We, for instance, and the same even goes with the current auction, which we have just launched on renewables. It's brand new. It's a historical process for us. And many, they are knowns, but they also are known unknowns in this process. So just be ready that, and also the same goes with the partners, with the BRD, with whom we are working closely. And I think the EIB is also involved in with certain private projects, is to know that there are certain elements which are not even aware to ourselves. So you just need to get prepared. There's security risks sometimes, and always aim to have a bigger picture and take into account that there's an element of uncertainty. That's how I would put it. And overall, I would add it in when it comes to energy transition, when it comes to climate adaptation, having a smooth collaboration with your neighbors, with your partners, it's of utmost importance. At times, I even tend to think that you have to be, you have to do energy diplomacy at its best to deploy it, because, again, these adaptation measures, and the natural disasters, they don't stop within our borders. And also, we need to learn to perhaps talk properly, openly about these issues with our respective neighbors. We're a small country. We have only 2 neighbors, not 9 neighbors like Germany. So we need to make sure that we are well aligned and coordinating on those respective actions as well.
Thank you so much. And thanks for highlighting both the learning by doing and innovation. And I guess doing adaptation well requires us to be adaptive in how we put that in practice as well. And also ending on that note of partnerships and how critical that is. So then maybe passing on to you, Mathilde, and especially partners like EIB and EU and UNDP, where do you see their role in helping scale this up and focusing on complementarities and partnerships?
Thank you. I think we can do much better. Just to cut a long story short on partnership, we have started. This ACAMED, as I was saying, is certainly very important. I think we also need to work better as a platform. So we're talking a lot about country platforms here on various panels and discussion set up. A lot about mitigation. There is no reason why it should stay on mitigation. The country platform should be around supporting the development of the countries with a climate mitigation and adaptation resilience, and nature also favorable to nature. I'm climate and nature head, so I never forget. And by the way, on adaptation and nature, there's a lot to do together. So those country platform led by strong ownership of those countries would be instrumental. Now here we hear the question was more on the donor side, and to me a country platform is a country issue. Another level is how we do better together. Typically, there is a Team Europe initiative which is being discussed, where you have grabs of funding from all of us. We are participating, we bring bricks of this support. We need to, all of us, European partners mainly, we need to be able to coordinate much better in all this. And when you take the adaptation principle, that you need to work on knowledge, you need to work on capacity building, and you need to work together on building up the investment, I think there is not more to propose than simply sharing the resources, sharing this knowledge, socializing what we are doing, being transparent under the leadership of the countries always, because we are working upon your requests, and we can really do better in this matter. So it's really a call for us to progress on this. I can give many more examples, but let me stop there.
Thank you, Mathilde, and especially on the call to share information, be transparent, and really come together under the leadership and the request and the behest of the countries. So thank you for that. And then, Anne, over to you in terms of a same question, but it's like, what would be the advice? How can we convene partnerships, maybe also especially private sector, and what would you be advised to UNDP and EIB and others from where you sit in terms of the gaps? Thank you.
Thank you. I just got inspired by my neighbour here to say that, because I think an important role is actually also in bringing together lessons, what works, what has worked, what will work, what worked in which context and why, or why didn't something work. And I think organizations, including UNDP and others, have a key role in that. We used to say, or everybody used to say endlessly, that adaptation is context and location specific, but what we see is that we are facing the same issues, the same disasters. Of course they have different impacts in different contexts, but there should be cross-cutting lessons to draw. We can't keep saying it's very specific. So that would be one obvious role also for UNEP, of course, but where we really need to fill a gap. Then I think, if coming back to the business and the private sector and business and finance models, is also an area where I think there could be much more done, where we're still only scratching the surface. And it can be large infrastructure investments, of course, climate proofing them, climate resilience, mainstreaming that into large infrastructure investments. But it's also at the ground level. So we've done a lot of small interventions in countries together with local partners, because who are being impacted? It's small-scale farmers, it's small shop owners, and often they don't know that there might be measures they can take to climate-proof their businesses, basically, or to ensure that their crops are not destroyed and so forth. So it's all the way from the very low scale to the extremely high national scale, where I think we can become much better in setting up frameworks, business models and support. And also, of course, we talked about that we need to de-risk investments overall for mitigation, for adaptation and for development in general. So those are, of course, areas where I also see the connections between some of the banks and the UN organizations and others could form really even stronger partnerships than they have today. So let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Anne, and especially on the reality of a business case and the business model for adaptation is important. At the very least, perhaps, understanding the cost of inaction, but maybe there's also opportunities in a business case, but really about sharing of these lessons and best practices help us get to that kind of positive experience of and then implementing practices on the ground. So thank you very much for the discussion. I just want to now open up for any questions colleagues in the audience have for our panelists here. Thank you, Alina.
Hi.
Many other things, so if I could say goodbye, thank you.
So, thank you so much, Abdallah, and thank you so much for coming. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for this discussion. Eva Telinova from the African Climate Foundation. We are in the process of setting up adaptation and resilience investment platforms, country-led investment platforms. So I love the remarks on this topic. I completely agree we need to share more experience and that this concept across countries and geographies has similarities. My question is on the business case for adaptation, and in particular, how can country platforms perhaps make a better business case and get the private sector to invest, in how that kind of concept and our collective work can really help make that point to the private sector.
Should we take a couple of questions, and it also allows you to think a little bit about the responses? Anyone else?
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Martin Prowse from Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. I'd like to ask the panel to elaborate a bit more on preemptive financing, and just to explain more around the kind of financing that's required there and the benefits of early preemptive financing to meet adaptation challenges. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to take the first question?
Thank you. On the business case, I think really we need to switch when we talk about adaptation finance and private sector from the way we see blended finance on the energy sector. And we need to look into, in fact, how businesses are impacted by climate change as well, and how adaptation, resilience, disaster risk management has to be incorporated in the global policies of the countries. This is where on country platforms are so needed, actually. So, I mean, you can have private sector at various levels. If I take another type of example, for instance, which is a mix of mitigation and adaptation, but as I have a Secretary of State on the energy next to me. One of the discussions we're having currently with the insurance sector, typically when you have a public, a utility, public or private, by the way, which is highly dependent on hydropower, which may face liquidity difficulties in a tough year. So maybe I'll also start answering the question of the gentleman on the side. You can find solutions, long-term solution, to have a financing tool which help them go through the difficult years without jeopardizing their whole financial sustainability, and knowing the importance of the energy sector generally on the sovereign risk without jeopardizing the sovereign risk itself. So this is crucial, and this can be done with a mix of public and private support if you put in place the relevant buffer to go through these difficult years. Of course, we need to assess if we have too many difficult years, then it may become another type of challenge. But it can be assessed, it can be designed, and this is where public and private financing and support can be done. So this is one type of business. The other is really what was said also. The private sector, the small farmers, or even the question of having access to financial services, to build the resilience of the population, it's also a question of private sector services. It's microfinance, notably. This is also something on which we need to work to build on, to bring in private sector funding. And I guess this is why you're also saying that we don't completely know what is the private sector adaptation finance, because we know that in fact a part of it is already being embedded into their practice and how they react in managing their own business, adapting to climate change. But there is no reason for them to report on that, and that's fine. I mean, but so we lack a little bit of knowledge on that, and maybe this is one of the reasons why we still lack a little bit of innovative funding to really enhance the private sector capacity to be more resilient. That would be part of my answer.
Thank you, Mathilde. Ms. Caroline.
I can give the example, the experience we had with the renewable auctions and the process we went through. I think, look, private sector is very sort of clear in that sense. They want you to, us, meaning the decision makers or policy makers, to de-risk as much as possible any, let's say, security risks, that you provide some guarantees to them, to mitigate any possible risk. They're very clear about that. They want to make certainty that they will have the profit out of the capex invested in. I think they also are looking for a policy certainty. And Eastern Europe can be volatile. And so how can you bring that confidence up front and the trust that, hey, this regulatory framework on renewables law, it's not going to change every 4 years or every 2 years. It's something solid and it's worth investing into. That's the second element. Then third, it's also a long-term vision. They don't think in 4 years term. They think in 10 years term plus, yeah? So they want to see that vision in terms of emissions reduction, in terms of targets. How much installed capacity of wind or solar do you aim by 2030? How much investments are you planning to do in grids? Yeah, deployment, modernization, adaptation, adjustments. And grids is another separate issue. But also I think when it comes to also coming with more innovative solutions. So we tried, to engage with Ministry of Finance to perhaps seek some, tax exemptions, say for wind turbines. We're not even talking, they don't want to hear it. But for certain technologies where we are missing the investments, even biogas, but we didn't trigger that much that interest. And maybe if you allow me to answer a bit the second question on preemptive financing, I think. For instance, right now we are currently developing, we are undergoing a whole and a full process of infrastructure investments. I'm just thinking, how much of those roads, bridges and whatnot do they take into account and they prioritize adaptation climate policy? It's also a question, in fact, and I think that's where the role of IFIs should come as well. Because where they put their money, it's also risk that, if that investment will be affected in a few years' time. So all this should be transversal, the adaptation policy, and they should be secured in any investment as such, prioritized.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Anna, anything on the preemptive financing or any more? Or otherwise, we'll... Yeah, okay. Okay, great. Any more questions? Alina?
Thank you. Thank you so much to the panelists. I was actually interested in your take on measuring progress on adaptation. The MDBs have collectively put a lot of effort this year into shifting our focus just solely on volume of finance for mitigation adaptation, and looked at developing a common approach on climate results, including on adaptation and resilience. There's a lot of discussion on progress as well in the negotiation space around the global goal and adaptation. Just really interested in your take on approaches, views on how do we know what our finance is actually achieving on the ground.
maybe a bit technical on the outcome metrics. I'll take it. But great, because it allows me to make a point I really wanted to emphasize as well. The work that has been done by the MDBs group to define and to start to have a common framework to measure the outcome of the project is really relevant, really. It's important to speak a common language on the direct impacts of the projects, which you already hear where I'm going. So this is good. We had I was on the MDB pavilion when the framework was launched, and I could also emphasize the support of the International Development Finance Club, which IFD is participating, willing to join this effort. This is good. This is not sufficient to me, because here we're, especially on adaptation, we have to select a few type of outcomes when in fact what needs to be assessed is the resilience of a population and a region, a territory again. So it's much, of course, more complex than only saying that X people have been supported with local services which enhance their resilience. It's good to do that, but it's not sufficient to completely assess whether or not they are out of vulnerabilities. So and I'm not sure we will ever find a way to completely be as development finance institution able to show this impact, because it's not only attributable to us. So we can only measure what we can directly attribute to our funding. The resilience is the country role. We are supporting a country approach, a country platform, country policies, vision on the territories. And so this is what is good in the framework, is that there is this layer, the first level, which is about the country transitions and how this is measured, and that it's not attributed to the MDBs or the DFI. This is very good, because this is very important. In the end, this is what we need to transform, the transformation that we need to follow. And therefore, maybe it's my last point. You talked a lot about transformational finance. Thank you. I do believe, us as DFI, in addition to measuring this outcome, we have to characterize how our funding is supporting deep transformations through a variety of tools. The world are not always easy in the morning. A diversity of tools would be easier to say. Through partnerships all together, then we can certainly show that we can be more transformational with the use of this funding and support deep transformations of the countries.
Thank you. Anybody else? Maybe one last question, and then we'll move towards the closing.
Hello. Sorry if this point was addressed when I was not present. You said that the resilience strategy depends on the country, okay, but also by my experience, I know that some countries don't have the money necessary to pay for a feasibility study or a professional assessment of resilience and adaptation. So is there money in development banks or agencies of this kind to finance the feasibility study that would be the support of a country to design a resilience strategy tailor-made for the country?
Yeah.
Thank you. You have multiple programs, in fact, and of course the question is also for the countries to drive around the complexity of these multiple programs, from bilateral DFIs, which are represent, to European support, UN support, vertical climate funds, plenty. I don't say the money is sufficient here. There is a discussion on the quantum, and so I don't enter this part of the discussion. The more the better. We'll be happy to support the implementation of course, this part. So there are indeed funding. What is critical is to make sure that we are progressing on how they are deployed. The only way to do it is through better coordination, partnership, as I was saying. And maybe I was explaining indeed at the beginning of the panel, typically the type of, we have been able to work on various type of projects, notably through a program which is called adaptation. And there you can develop new practices, incorporating vulnerabilities assessment much more, working with the local communities much more, trying to bring this into the discussion with the government and the regional level, because quite often the discussion is well advanced at the national level than to the government level, and it's more, the more you go to the local authority and civil society local level, the more the coordination has to be strengthened. This is also what you referred to on locally led adaptation. We are partnering with UNCDF local around the Mediterranean with the European Union on this adaptation program, ACAMED. So this is typically something which can certainly support.
My experience as such with pre-feasibility studies is that usually when there is an interest from the side of the IFI into that respective project, or even, I mean, I can give you a few examples. For instance, we have managed to convince, I'm not going to say who because it's not about, I mean, okay, UNECE, to do a study to us on the different degrees of vulnerability, energy poverty basically, so that we can better deploy this energy efficiency programs in the residential sector. Because tariffs, they change, they get higher or lower. Right now they are lower. So you want to better fine-tune these programs in accordance with people's vulnerability degree. There will be no problem in identifying, and I'm absolutely sure about this. Usually it's not even a problem of finance if it's a good and much needed pre-feasibility study. If it's absolutely needed for a national program or even for massive investments in a specific sector, even the private sector can come up front, chip in, and we'll do it because it's a pre-feasibility study. We're talking about, I don't know, 100-something thousand euros. It's doable, it's feasible, if it's worth doing it. So if the project is well written, there's a problem needed, and the solution can come up front with the pre-feasibility study, it's solvable. That's my overall experience. I've never had any issue with we cannot find finance because no one wants to do it. Maybe because it's not needed actually then.
Thank you. I mean, with that, I think we're coming to a close. So let me ask the audience to give a round of applause for a wonderful panelists, all female panelists. I'm very happy
and
to.
Moderator.
And thank you. And so much. Thank you so much again for EU, EIB, DG NIA, and of course UNDP is very happy to be part of this collaboration. And thank you so much for all the examples and lessons. And hopefully it's not the first adaptation panel and it continues. So again, thank you so much. Thank you all for your time. Thank you so much.